Carmichael, professor of history here at Gettysburg College, also director of the Civil War Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ari Kelman. He is the associate professor of history, professor of history at the University of California, Davis. And he's there for 10 more days, I believe, before he will take his new position at Penn State University. Richard Civil War Center, and he's holding a chair there, the McCabe Career Professorship of Civil War Studies. Ari does a range of subject matter in the classroom, Civil War and Reconstruction, of course, as well as environmental history and Native American history. He's the author of numerous articles and books. 2003, he published River and Its City, The Nature of Landscape in New Orleans. And his most recent work, published by Harvard University, is A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek. This book has racked up quite a few awards, including the Tom Watson Brown Prize. It is considered by many, in fact by most, to be the most distinguished prize in Civil War history. He's also sharing the Bancroft Prize. He's won the Craven Prize. And I guess the Nobel Prize is next. I don't want to be a downer here, man, but I don't think 2015 is going to be as good for you as 2015. He gets in a down chair and all these awards. And I tell you, this is a beautifully written book, and we're very happy to have Ari here at the Civil War Institute.
Thanks very much for that very kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for your patience in advance. I woke up this morning quite nervous, more nervous than I often am when I'm going to be giving a talk. And I think I noticed yesterday that a number of you are teachers. Is that right? Woo-hoo. People, yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I can just look at Kevin if I need to. Kevin, you teach, right? In addition to blogging. Sorry, Pete. And so you're used to being in front of unruly crowds, and you may also have some experience with a particularly nerve-wracking speaking engagement. One of those engagements where you're not quite sure if the subject matter of your talk fits with the event at hand. And then adding to that, you learn that perhaps, I don't know, C-SPAN is going to broadcast your talk on television because, hey, live television, that still happens apparently. But if you've done any public speaking, you also know that moment where that sense of real calm settles over you. I know that Pete knows that because I've now watched him speak beautifully a number of times in the past couple of days. I just want to let you know that is not happening here. And so, without further ado, as many of you may know, on November 29th, 1864, approximately 700 troops from the 1st and 3rd Colorado regiments, led by Colonel John Chivington, attacked an Arapahoe and Cheyenne encampment nestled in a bend of Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado Territory. Some 900 Native people who believed they'd recently made peace with white authorities fled up the dry creek bed that morning. The onslaught left somewhere between 150 and maybe as many as 225 of them dead, the overwhelming majority of whom were women, children, or the elderly. Chivington's surviving troops disgraced themselves by combing the field for what one of them called trophies, scalps, fingers, and the genitalia of their victims. The soldiers then burned the village before returning to Denver, Colorado, where they were treated as heroes. In the weeks after Sand Creek, Chivington's men exhibited their plunder at the downtown theater. Nearly a century and a half later, on April 28, 2007, the National Park Service opened its 391st unit, the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. The ceremony that day was equal parts celebration and memorial service. After drum groups went silent, a Cheyenne chief began the event with a prayer, then members of Congress, Colorado's governor at the time, leaders from 4 Native American tribes, local politicians, and Park Service officials all shared their views of what the historic site might accomplish in the coming years. The speakers, for the most part, struck an optimistic pose. The site, they said, honored the memory of Sand Creek's victims. It promised long-deferred healing. That was a word that was used regularly. Long-deferred healing to the affected tribes, and it also offered a blueprint for future cooperation between Native Americans and federal authorities. Collective remembrance, they indicated, if it was situated in a sufficiently sacred place, could heal a rift cut by violence between cultures. Now, I think probably most of you already know this, but memorials are always shaped by politics. Contemporary concerns inflect how history is presented at such places, because memorial designers look to the present and to the future as well as to the past when they do their work. This is especially true of national historic sites. Federal officials have long viewed commemoration as a kind of patriotic alchemy, as a way of conjuring unity from divisiveness by appealing to shared perceptions of the past. This is about as good as it gets for Civil War content. I'm kidding. You can take, for example, President Lincoln's first inaugural address. The president suggested that if Americans would pay heed to, quote, the mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, end quote. Those chords, he said, would once again, quote, swell the chorus of the Union, end quote. At historic sites around the United States, sentiments like President Lincoln, sentiments that evince an abiding faith in the nationalizing power of public memory are carved into stone. These monuments are supposed to serve the nation's interests by linking together its peoples and also legitimating federal authority. Out of common memories, the theory goes, Americans have and will continue to forge common identities. Memories of Sand Creek, speakers at the opening ceremony suggested, would play this role, allowing visitors to the National Historic Site to heal deep wounds. The justification for collective remembrance in the United States in recent years, from the Murrah Building in Oklahoma City to the 9/11 Memorial in Lower Manhattan, has often rested on a similar premise. The idea is that these memorials will comfort stricken communities and also a grieving nation. That the Sand Creek site was going to be the first unit in the national park system to label an event in which federal troops had killed Native people, a massacre, promised to deepen its utility in this regard. By remembering Chivington's victims and the country's history of racial violence, visitors would supposedly be able to transcend their own prejudices. This palliative vision, again, a vision predicated on the ideas that memorials can allow people to heal, this vision suffused most of the speeches early in the ceremony. But as some of you may know, or as you may already have said, Sand Creek is a very unlikely source for these sorts of utopian sentiments. And so dissenting voices, those of the Native people especially, who'd participated in the memorialization process, rejected what they saw as a hollow offer of painless reconciliation. This is Eugene Little Coyote, who at the time was the tribal chairman in the Northern Cheyenne tribe. These people feared that the Sand Creek Memorial might actually be a stalking horse for an older assimilationist project, for the federal government's long-standing effort to strip tribal peoples of their distinctive identities. And so, rather than accepting the site as a symbol of federal power, they portrayed the memorial as an emblem of tribal persistence and self-determination. Other participants at the opening ceremony expressed suspicions about the memorial for a host of additional reasons. Because the federal government was unpopular on Colorado's eastern plains, especially when it insinuated itself into local land use disputes. Because of charges of so-called political correctness hovering over what Marilyn Musgrave, pictured here, who at the time was Eastern Colorado's congressional representative, called, quote, gratuitous revisionism, end quote. And because of a gnawing sense that the word massacre somehow indicted the United States Army. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, with the nation embroiled in 2 wars overseas, some observers believed in 2007 that a memorial that questioned the military's rectitude in any way necessarily flirted with anti-Americanism. Over the next half hour or so, I'm going to suggest that the controversies in 2007 echoed a century and a half's wrangling over Sand Creek's memory, pivoting on a series of thorny questions. First of all, who was culpable for the bloodshed at Sand Creek? Was the violence better understood as a battle or as a massacre? And most important of all, what was the relationship between politics and violence on the American borderlands, and also between the process of continental expansion and the 2 wars, the Civil War and the Plains Indian Wars, spawned by that process of expansion? When the Sand Creek site sponsors tried to answer these questions, they learned that the massacre remained a history front in an ongoing culture war. Collective remembrance, it turned out, could just as easily tear scabs from old wounds as heal them. And so, while each new fight over American memory highlights the challenge of agreeing on a single historical narrative within the confines of a pluralistic society like the United States, the case of Sand Creek proved unusually complicated, especially so because competing stories of the massacre itself haunted the memorialization process. The first of those stories belonged to a Methodist minister and a staunch abolitionist named John Chivington. Chivington saw the violence at Sand Creek as a noble part of civilizing the American West and preserving the Union. Indeed, he saw those 2 processes as inextricably intertwined. And so he used the gallons of blood spilled along Sand Creek's banks to depict a master stroke. On November 29, 1864, in the afternoon, with Cheyenne and Arapaho corpses still cooling nearby, Chivington bragged to his superior, General Samuel Curtis, that his men, that Chivington's men, had attacked an Indian village, quote, bristling with 1,000 warriors. Chivington already at that time began a process of exaggerating the accomplishments of his troops. Chivington went on to say that his men had killed several chiefs and hundreds of their followers. He would later on increase that number to 500 and ultimately to 600 or 700. He then justified the attack by pointing to depredations that he said had been committed by the fallen enemy at Sand Creek. His men, he claimed, had whipped, quote, savages, end quote, guilty of desecrating white bodies. This was an outrage that he indicated surely demanded a quick reprisal dealt by shorthand. For the remainder of his life, John Chivington said that Sand Creek was a glorious battle. He made that argument in large measure by pointing to the bloodshed Civil War context and to the settlers' remains he claimed his men had recovered there. In spring 1865, for example, he testified to federal investigators looking into Sand Creek that, quote, rebel emissaries were sent among the Indians to incite them, end quote. What Chivington was saying was that white Coloradans were facing peril, that the Union was facing peril from the Indians that his men had killed at Sand Creek. Chivington went on to point to the Dakota Uprising in Minnesota, to the Cherokees' decision to fight with the Confederacy, and then noted that a Cheyenne warrior, a man named George Bent, had served as the South's agent in the run-up to Sand Creek, promising Colorado's Native American peoples that, quote, with the great father at Washington having all he could do to fight his children at the South, the Indians could regain their country, end quote. In this way, John Chivington made his victims at Sand Creek enemies not just of white settlers in Colorado, but of the Union more broadly. The bloodshed then became a triumph not just in the Indian Wars, but also the Civil War. Finally, in 1883, as he was nearing the end of his life, John Chivington spoke publicly for the last time about Sand Creek. He addressed a Colorado Heritage Organization at its annual banquet. Chivington remained very popular in Colorado until he died. He addressed this heritage organization and concluded his remarks, I believe the last words he said on the subject of Sand Creek, quote, I stand by Sand Creek. A man named Captain Silas Sewell did not. Prior to arriving in Colorado 4 years before the massacre, Sewell lived in Bleeding, Kansas, where as an ally of John Brown's, he earned a reputation as an abolitionist jayhawker. Sewell refused to commit the troops under him to the fight at Sand Creek, and he later wrote to a friend of his, a former commander, a man named Ned Wynkoop. Sewell insisted that the slaughter at Sand Creek had sullied the honorable fight for the Union and also the process of settling the West, and that native and not white bodies had been desecrated there. Sewell depicted a world of civilized Indians and savage whites. He cataloged the terrible cruelties visited upon the Sand Creek dead. The bodies of men, women, and children, he said, had all been hacked apart. He wrote to Wynkoop, quote, that he would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there, they meaning Chivington's troops. When Sewell testified to federal investigators looking into Sand Creek in the spring of 1865, he recounted how the previous summer he arranged a parley in Denver, Colorado between a group of peace chiefs, including Black Kettle, and also Governor John Evans, this is Black Kettle here, and also Governor John Evans and Colonel John Chivington. At that meeting, Chivington had told the chiefs, quote, that if they wanted peace, they must come into the post. Chivington was talking about Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. They must come into the post and subject themselves to military law, end quote. The Cheyennes and Arapahoes had complied, Sewell said. He then explained that Black Kettle's people had, as a result of that, believed before Sand Creek that they were under the protection of federal troops. Sewell's stories about Sand Creek took on added resonance when, on April 23, 1865, a soldier from the 2nd Colorado Cavalry murdered him in the streets of Denver. You have to understand the timing here. President Lincoln had been assassinated about a week earlier, and Sewell's death, like Lincoln's, spawned a number of conspiracy theories, including that Colonel Chivington had paid one of his former subordinates to have Silas Sewell silenced. For some observers, then, Sewell's memories of Sand Creek became the unimpeachable recollections of a martyr, a good man who'd been killed for standing by his principles and then for having the courage to speak truth to power. A federal official looking into Sand Creek wrote at the time, quote, "The barbarism of slavery has culminated in the assassination of Mr. Lincoln. The barbarism of Sand Creek has culminated in the assassination of Captain Sewell," end quote. This was a statement that foreshadowed some abolitionist decision to gravitate to the Indian reform movement in the years after the passage of the 13th Amendment. 3 federal investigations eventually determined that Sand Creek had been a bad act. One of them went so far as to call it a massacre. But John Chivington and other Westerners refused to accept those findings. And so, because Sand Creek represented such an unsettled chapter in the region's history, the fight over its memory continued for years afterward. In 1879, for example, author Helen Hunt Jackson embraced the cause of Indian reform. In letters to newspapers around the United States, she drew on Silas Sewell's recollections of Sand Creek. She used the massacre as a kind of cudgel. The Indians at Sand Creek, she said, had been peaceful, they'd been guaranteed protection by federal authorities, and Chivington's troops had desecrated the dead. Her charges rankled this man, a man named William Byers, who was editor of the Denver Rocky Mountain News in 1864, had dismissed claims that Sand Creek had been a massacre. In 1879, Byers ignored the ongoing Indian wars. He replied to Jackson that Sand Creek had actually pacified the Plains tribes, rather than spurring them to more violence. He also said that Jackson, who was originally from New England and a woman to boot, couldn't possibly understand the violence at Sand Creek. She possessed defeat sensibilities, he said, that were out of place in the rough and tumble West. Helen Hunt Jackson was no shrinking violet. She gave as good as she got. She rebutted Byers' sexism and regionalism with patriotic nationalism. The bloodshed after Sand Creek, she noted, occupied thousands of federal troops who otherwise might better have spent their time fighting Confederates. Sand Creek, in this view, hadn't just been a massacre, it had also detracted from the Union war effort. As Jackson engaged in this print war with Byers, she worked on a book about the nation's history of mistreating its indigenous peoples. Century of Dishonor, published in 1881, argued that only by overhauling federal Indian policy could the United States be redeemed in the eyes of God. With the Modoc War, the Red River War, and the Great Sioux War, including what was then known as the Custer Massacre at the Little Bighorn, just over, some officials in the Department of the Interior were primed to embrace Helen Hunt Jackson's calls for reform. But even as the climate surrounding federal-tribal relations was shifting, Chivington's perspective still had adherents in the West. including editors at the Gunnison Democrat, who, as Jackson worked on Century of Dishonor, called for, quote, another Sand Creek, end quote, to wipe out the Utes in the wake of the infamous Meeker Massacre. Infuriated by these kinds of sentiments, George Bent, son of a Borderlands trade tycoon named William Bent, an owl woman, his Cheyenne wife, weighed in on the history of Sand Creek. John Chivington was an eager perpetrator, and Silas Sewell was a reluctant witness. Bent, who is shown here with Magpie, his wife, was a victim and survivor of the ordeal. Wounded at Sand Creek, he fought for years after to keep memories of the massacre alive. Now, around the turn of the 20th century, Frederick Jackson Turner, speaking in Chicago at the World's Fair, fretted over the closing of the frontier. Conservationists warned of the impending extinction of the bison, as well as the native peoples who depended on those animals for survival. And readers consumed piles of novels about cowboys and Indians. The West, in popular culture and public policy, stood at the center of debates about the future of the United States, and George Bent worried that Native Americans had no voice in these conversations. He began relating tribal history to George Bird Grinnell, one of the founders of the field of professional anthropology, also to James Mooney, a renowned Smithsonian ethnographer who looks a little bit like Al Swearingen from Deadwood, and to George Hyde, a relatively obscure historian. Hyde, unfortunately, is obscure enough that I have no picture of him. I apologize for that. I'm keeping him obscure. It's competition between historians. In 1906, George Bent and George Hyde published together 6 articles in a magazine called The Frontier. In those articles, they debunked John Chivington's story of Sand Creek. Although Bent acknowledged, as Chivington had charged in 1865, that he, Bent, had fought with the Confederacy, he'd served in Sterling Price's 1st Missouri Cavalry, he mocked, quote, those men in Colorado who talked about rebel plots to ally with the region's Indians, end quote. The Kiowas and Comanches, Bent noted, were, quote, inveterate foes of Texas, end quote, and the Arapahoes and Cheyennes, though hardly staunch Unionists, he allowed, had no incentive at all to fight with the South. Turning to the massacre, Bent related details of Chivington's betrayal of the peace chiefs, of American and white flags flying over Black Kettle's Lodge, and of the Colorado troops' butchery. Bent understood the Civil War as a war of imperialism rather than liberation, and he concluded that Chivington had wrought with Sand Creek the very thing that he'd always claimed to have prevented, a conflict that threatened, if only briefly, expansion into the West. Not surprisingly, George Bent's essays outraged John Chivington's surviving men. Major Jacob Downing resented the charge that he and his comrades had perpetrated a massacre, that their actions had somehow dishonored their service, and that an Indian had dared to suggest that a white man might be uncivilized. Downing responded to George Bent in the Denver Times, labeling him a cutthroat and a thief, a liar and a scoundrel, but worst of all, a half-breed, end quote. He then turned his attention to embedding John Chivington's Sand Creek stories into a Civil War narrative that heritage groups were constructing around the United States at the time, work that culminated in Denver with the unveiling of a memorial on the state capitol steps in 1909. The monument featured a plaque on its base cataloging battles and engagements in which Coloradans had fought during the war. Sand Creek was among them. Your lower right. With veterans of the Civil War nearing the end of their lives, campaigns to shape how future generations would remember the conflict swept the United States. Archives at the time acquired document collections, authors published regimental histories, and cities unveiled monuments and memorials. As David Blight, of course, and other scholars have argued in recent years, these efforts were often intended to inspire onlookers to embrace a reconciliationist narrative of the war. Carrie Janney is here, I apologize. A heroic story in which Northern and Southern soldiers had fought bravely and well. The war's root causes, struggles over the fate of slavery, over competing definitions of federal authority and citizenship, and over the right to shape an emerging American empire in the trans-Mississippi West, could and indeed should be set aside in service of an amicable reunion between North and South. In short, upholding patriotic orthodoxy sometimes demanded collective amnesia rather than remembrance. Stewards of the Civil War's memory in Colorado realized that if their state was going to be included in this emerging Civil War story, Sand Creek was going to have to be remembered as a battle or an engagement. At the statue's dedication, then, organizers stitched together national unity and regional pride. They seamlessly integrated visions of empire and liberty. A military band balanced the emancipationist spirit of marching through Georgia with the lost cause nostalgia of Dixie. One speaker invoked the spirit of reconciliation, suggesting, quote, "We're all Americans today, and we all glory in one flag and one country," end quote. Then General Irving Hale, who gained fame in the Spanish-American War and later helped found the Veterans of Foreign Wars, celebrated the Civil War for, quote, "making freedom universal for all Americans," end quote. Hale's remarks, of course, ignored the conflict's impact on Native peoples, including the Arapahoes and Cheyennes. The memorial sponsors had smoothed away the Sand Creek Massacre's rough edges and cast John Chivington's stories of the tragedy in bronze. Less than half a century later, Coloradans working against a very different political backdrop reversed course. They began segregating memories of Sand Creek from those of the Civil War and associating the bloodshed exclusively with westward expansion. On August 6, 1950, the state unveiled two historic markers. The first of those, an open marble slab, sat on a rise overlooking the massacre site. For the rest of my talk, I'm going to ask that you keep this image in the back of your mind. When I refer to the monument overlook, and I'll do so a number of additional times, this is what I'm talking about. That rise there that you see in the distance behind those trees, that is the monument overlook at the Sand Creek site. That marker echoed John Chivington. It read Sand Creek Battleground, as you can see here. The second marker, an obelisk sponsored by the State Historical Society, included the mixed message, quote, "Sand Creek Battle or Massacre," end quote, and labeled the bloodshed, quote, "a regrettable tragedy of the conquest of the West," end quote. This was an interpretation born of the need to placate Historical Society donors and also local people, some of whom then as now didn't relish being told that they had a massacre site in their backyard. Leroy Hafen, who at the time was Colorado's chief historian, oversaw both dedication ceremonies and noted of Sand Creek that, quote, "some have called it a battle while others have labeled it a massacre," end quote. Hafen then ducked the fight over naming. He described the violence as, quote, "a tragic engagement, an outgrowth of manifest destiny, of contact between the incompatible cultures of red and white men," end quote. In this way, Hafen elided responsibility for Sand Creek and divorced the massacre from its Civil War context. This made good sense at the start of the Cold War. For more than a decade, federal authorities had drummed up support for internationalism by encouraging Americans to recall the Civil War as an emblem of the nation's commitment, its ironclad commitment to freedom. Sand Creek, bathed in an increasingly ambiguous light in these years, didn't fit with this vision of the Civil War as an unalloyed good war. By the 1960s, more changes in the nation's cultural and political climate had seeded the ground for still another reappraisal of Sand Creek. Late in the decade, a group of tribal activists formed AIM, the American Indian Movement. And a year later, in 1969, some of that organization's members helped to take over Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, signaling the arrival of what was being called Red Power on the national stage. A week before the Alcatraz occupation, a journalist named Seymour Hersh had broken the story of atrocities committed by U.S. troops in the Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai. And so in 1970, when Dee Brown published Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the civil rights movement was maintaining a steady focus on issues of racial inequality. Many white Americans, part of the so-called New Age, were fascinated by traditional indigenous cultures, and Americans had once again confronted the capacity of U.S. soldiers, sometimes to slaughter innocent civilians. Brown's book thus found an audience eager to learn more about Native peoples and keen in some instances to embrace critiques of American militarism and racism. For much of his adult life, Dee Brown worked at the University of Illinois Library. At night, he wrote books. I mean, can you imagine someone more heroic than a historian and a librarian? Doesn't get you. At night, D. Brown wrote books, including Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, A History of the American West's Conquest Through the Eyes of Its Dispossessed Tribal Peoples. Of his authorial voice, Brown said, quote, "I'm a very old Indian and I'm remembering the past." Those memories included Sand Creek, for which Brown adopted a narrative arc and interpretive frame similar to Silas Sewell's and George Bent's, focusing on the white and American flags flying over Black Kettle's village, on Chief White Antelope falling in a hail of bullets while singing his death song, and on Chivington's men slicing genitalia from their victims. Professional historians greeted the publication of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee with skepticism that in many instances bordered on contempt. D. Brown, they said, had eschewed scholarly balance, he'd written a polemic, he hadn't interrogated his native sources, he'd distorted evidence and made errors of fact. Reviewers outside the Academy, though, heaped praise on Brown. The New York Times described Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee as, quote, "both impossible to read and impossible to put down," end quote. The public agreed. The book spent more than a year on the New York Times bestseller list and has since sold more than 5 million copies. That's even better than these books have done, I think. It also had a huge influence on readers, including a rising generation of scholars who self-identified as New Western historians. Paul Hutton, for example, has said, quote, "We all went to bed thinking about the Indian Wars and Indians one way, and we woke up the next morning after that book was published, and we never thought the same way again," end quote. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee's impact could still be felt in 1998 when Congress created the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. But even then, even after nearly a century and a half of struggles over the massacre's memory, the Park Service learned that enduring questions surrounding the violence remained unanswered. In 1998, the Park Service began planning for this site, and it discovered that there was a new question that caught it off guard. Where precisely had Sand Creek taken place? It turned out in 1998 that before Sand Creek could be memorialized, it first had to be found. The search that ensued became contentious when epistemological disagreements over how to interpret the historical record divided the people looking for the site. Native American descendants of Sand Creek's victims typically based their understanding of the episode's history and geography on what they described as traditional tribal methods, also on oral histories and on written records, including stories and maps produced by George Bent around the turn of the 20th century. For decades, the Sand Creek descendants had used George Bent's maps and writings as a guide. They made pilgrimages to a spot near the monument overlook where they performed sacred ceremonies and honored their ancestors. And I don't think I should leave the podium because I'm being filmed, but I'll tell you that if you look at the bend that you're seeing here in this slide, the monument overlook is just below the creek, and I'll give you a better sense of this in a moment. The Park Service, by contrast, tried to solve the mystery of the killing field's location by looking at other materials, especially records produced by troops who had fought at Sand Creek, and then by consulting a map penned by a soldier named Samuel Bonsall, who had visited the site after the massacre with William Tecumseh Sherman, then in charge of the United States forces in the West. This was in 1869. Using Bonsall's map, NPS officials believed they pinpointed Black Kettle's village, located less than a mile upstream from the monument overlook. You can see on the map here, the lower center, it says Chivington's Massacre. They looked at this, and they thought that they found that they pinpointed the exact location of Black Kettle's village, which was located less than a mile upstream from the monument overlook. The Park Service then did an archaeological investigation and unearthed a huge band of artifacts which seem to confirm this hypothesis. And so if you look at this map, you can see, I think it says existing marker. That's the monument overlook. You can see just a very, very few dots nestled in that bend of Sand Creek. And then if you move up the creek about 3/5 of a mile or so, you can see a number of dots indicating this plume of artifacts that the Park Service unearthed. Many of the descendants were outraged, though, by these discoveries. They were outraged especially because the NPS seemed to be relying on sources produced by Sand Creek's perpetrators rather than its victims. They pointed back to George Bent's maps, insisting that Bent, a Cheyenne survivor of the massacre, had clearly placed Black Kettle's village inside a crook of Sand Creek. And so if you look at number 2 here, and then if you look at this close-up of the key, you can see Black Kettle's camp, that it clearly placed Black Kettle's camp inside this crook of the creek. They then produced their own map of the massacre site, including Black Kettle's village, which they located precisely where they believed George Bent had placed it a century earlier. And so here you can see 2 different maps. One is the National Park Service's map. The other is a map produced by the Northern Cheyenne, the Southern Cheyenne, and the Southern Arapaho descendants of Sand Creek's victims. The Park Service was caught off guard by this dispute over competing cartographies, but eventually floated a very elegant compromise. A site with boundaries that were and are capacious enough to encompass all of the different interpretations of exactly where Sand Creek happened. So again, if you look at this map, you'll see that the monument overlook is included within the park, as is that site further upstream where the artifacts were found. After a number of additional twists and turns, including a casino corporation stepping in to broker a deal that secured the property for the memorial, the Park Service was ready to cut the ribbon on the Sand Creek site, all of which leads back to April 28, 2007, when the first unit of the National Park System to label American soldiers as perpetrators rather than heroes or victims opened its doors. Although the site's name answered the question of what Sand Creek would be called, how to interpret the massacre remained unresolved. Ironically, as the United States celebrates the Civil War sesquicentennial, the Sand Creek site's name challenges visitors not because the Park Service asks them anew whether the bloodshed was a battle or a massacre, but because that question seems to have been answered by the park's name. The stories Americans tell themselves about the Civil War suggest that President Lincoln died so that the United States might live. Redeemed for having liberated the South's slaves out of a paroxysm of bloodshed, the nation was reborn. It's a resurrection story that fits neatly within Christian narratives of catharsis through suffering. In this way, we transfigure the Civil War's history of violence into one of virtue, and its tragedies into triumphs. But Sand Creek, depicted as a massacre at the historic site, bucks the redemptive and reconciliationist currents that run through most national historic sites. We typically favor neat depictions of our history as marked by steady progress, punctuated by the occasional righteous war, a vision that rationalizes an often chaotic and fractured past. The Sand Creek site, though, reminds visitors that as much as they might wish that their history had proceeded in regimented fashion, the past can't be so easily drilled to fall into line. The massacre story indicts characters usually cast as heroes in the American imagination, citizen soldiers, overland pioneers, Union officials, and reflects a darker vision of the Civil War's causes and consequences. Expansion into the American West touched off the war that destroyed slavery, it's true, but also other wars with the Plains tribes that left behind no simple lessons for federal commemorators who may be intent on bending public memory to nationalist ends. The Park Service is still grappling with how to interpret Sand Creek, an irredeemable tragedy that casts doubt on the enduring notion that the United States enjoys a special destiny as an exceptional nation favored by God. The question of whether visitors to the Sand Creek site are ready to broach these sorts of very difficult topics, to reassess their homeland's character and perhaps its destiny, remains unanswered. For in the end, this story of memorializing Sand Creek suggests that history and memory are both malleable, if not always biddable, and that the people of the United States are so various that they shouldn't be expected to share a single tale of a common past. Sometimes our stories complement one another, sometimes they clash, sometimes they intersect, sometimes they diverge. Depending on who tells it, the story of Sand Creek suggests that the Civil War more broadly midwifed, in President Lincoln's words, a new birth of freedom, but also that it delivered the Indian Wars, that it was a moment of national redemption for some, but of dispossession and subjugation for others. But the Civil War was both a war of liberation and also of empire. The Park Service and tribal descendants are never going to concur on every element of Sand Creek's interpretation, but they may agree that the historic site should challenge visitors to grapple with competing narratives of U.S. history, to struggle with how the past is shot through with ironies. If that happens, the massacre I suggest in my book, product placement portion of the talk, if that happens, the massacre will no longer be misplaced in the landscape of national memory. Thank you very much.
Right around 1971, Hollywood did a movie about this called Soldier Blue.
Yep.
And as I recall, the movie showed that the Native Americans didn't have any weapons. So there wasn't really a battle there. I'm under the impression that it was a massacre. And they did some atrocious things. And one of the soldiers approached the colonel and said, hey, you need to stop doing this. You need to not allow this to happen. And they were doing these things to their bodies. And the colonel said to the soldier, you're insane. So the guy that was trying to stop this atrocity was called insane. But anyway, one of the things that I was wondering about is how many women were killed, how many children were killed, and how many men were killed. I was under the impression there that there weren't very many men in the first place. Thank you.
Sure. First of all, Soldier Blue is part of this sort of cultural constellation in the early 1970s, Little Big Man, Soldier Blue, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, a number of other texts, as historians like to say, that come out, all of which are very, very much a byproduct of critiques of the war in Vietnam, and which allows for a reappraisal of the Indian Wars. And so Soldier Blue, I think of as being very, very much of a piece with Dee Brown's work. As to the question of how many women and children were killed there, we don't have exact numbers. To the best of, and I'm going to be very clear, it's not to the best of my ability. I should stop and say, I am by no means the leading authority on the massacre itself. I write about the way that this event was remembered, and so I draw on other people when I talk about the massacre. But the historians of the massacre itself, as I said at the top of the talk, they think that somewhere between 150, maybe as many as 225 or 250 Native Americans were killed at Sand Creek. Of those, something like 90% probably were women and children. A couple of reasons for that, most important of which is that most of the men in Black Kettle's camp were out hunting. And the people in this camp genuinely believed that they were part of a peace camp, that this camp was being protected by federal soldiers. They thought that they had nothing to fear in that moment, and so warriors were away at the time of the attack. And so there just weren't very many there weren't very many men in the camp, which accounts for why so few of them were killed. That said, one other point very, very quickly. The Native people there were armed. They weren't particularly well armed, but they were armed. They did fight back. Chivington lost somewhere between maybe a dozen to 24 of his men. So it was a very, very violent encounter that lasted the better part of a day and that ran across about 6 miles. It was a running engagement. So it was a pretty grim scene. If I go back and forth, is that right?
Could you just talk about the Washita then? How is the Park Service going to interpret the Washita, which I know that's Civil War connection because of Custer, but you look at the battle and how it was fought, it's very similar. You can say that Custer's approach to the Washita was similar to Chivington's, which was similar to his approach to the Little Bighorn. So how, everybody says Custer was massacred at Little Bighorn, he ran into too many Indians, right? But at the Washita and at Sand Creek, it was the other way around. So what is the Park Service now doing about Washita?
Washita is an extraordinarily controversial site for a variety of different reasons, but especially because it's been labeled a battlefield. The tribal descendants believe that it too was a massacre site. The historiography on the Washita is, I would say, far more mixed than it is about Sand Creek. The overwhelming majority of historians now call Sand Creek a massacre. There are some who still insist that it was a battle. That's really not true of the Washita. The Washita was a much more complicated affair. As you probably know, Black Kettle, who survived Sand Creek, sort of wandered in the wilderness, you might say, I'm speaking metaphorically now, for several years. His reputation suffered very badly within the Cheyenne community, or communities really, because of Sand Creek. And then tragically he was killed. He remained a peacemaker, but he was killed at the Washita. And that's a large part of the reason that the Southern Cheyennes especially would like the Washita to be reinterpreted as a massacre site. But for now, at least, that's not happening.
Two-part question, really quickly. How did the Lincoln administration, the American colonies, factor in the Sand Creek Massacre? Two, with the establishment of the Sand Creek Historic Site, what is the future of NPS interpreting future of other massacres, not within the American, other Massachusetts, probably, and other tragedies that occurred in the United States?
Those are really good questions, but they're not really quick. So the first part, how does federal Indian policy figure in the Sand Creek? I'm writing a book about that right now. I mean, that's a really obnoxious historian's answer, right? You have to read the next book, which probably won't come out for another 10 years because I'm really slow. But I'll give you the very, very short answer and just say that I think that the Civil War, as I indicated in the talk, was both, or I should say became both a war of liberation, but emerged from the get-go as a war of empire. The 1860 election, which tends to be remembered popularly, and I think also to some extent by historians, as an election that was fought over the fate of slavery, was an election that was fought over the fate of slavery in the American West. The question was whether or not slavery would move into territory that had been conquered in the United States-Mexican War, and what happens is that you've got, or what happened, I'm going to speak in the past tense, what happened was that there were two competing visions for how to settle the West. And so the 1860 election was, in addition to a kind of referendum on the fate of slavery, it was also a referendum on American empire. Nobody thought, or I shouldn't say nobody, very, very few people in the American electorate in 1860 believed that the United States shouldn't move into the West. The question was, how was it going to do that? The Republican Party, of course, wins the 1860 election, and so you have a centralized vision of American empire, which will be driven by the Pacific Railroad Act, by the Homestead Act, by the Morrill Land Grant College Act, all of which are passed in the 1862, is it the Second Congress in 1862? I'm looking at a real Civil War story now. And so something like Sand Creek, or the Dakota Uprising, or the Navajo's Long Walk, a number of other episodes, all of these emerge out of the move into the West, because that move is going to collide with the people who already live there. Now your second question about what does Sand Creek mean for the Park Service, interpreting, memorializing additional massacres, honestly, that's quicker because I don't know. I can tell you that if you read the book, and again, totally obnoxious answer, I apologize, you should buy like 8 copies though. But if you read the book, what you'll discover is that the Park Service went into the effort to memorialize Sand Creek with extraordinarily high hopes. That this was going to be an opportunity to burnish the Park Service's multicultural credentials, to reach out to Native American communities, to interpret more Native American sites, But the process was really very, very difficult, and a number of people in the NPS ended up feeling like, boy, we made a lot more enemies than we made friends. And so I don't know what will come of it. I really don't.
Dennis Graham, Hagerstown, Maryland. You mentioned the discrepancy of where the village was located. Was there any archaeological excavation done at the location where the descendants of the victims claim it was that might prove their point?
Yes, the archaeological excavations took place up and down the creek, and actually in other areas as well. There were 4 or 5 different spots where the Park Service dug. One of those was right in the crook of the bend. The explanation that the landowner who held the property at that spot, the monument overlook and the north side of the creek, of Sand Creek, the explanation that he gave for why there were no artifacts discovered there was that through the years, collectors had come through that location, which people in Cuyahoga County in southeastern Colorado understood to be the proper Sand Creek site, also called the traditional site, and that they had kicked that site clean over the course of decades. He pointed especially to a number of Dust Bowl years in the 1950s when most of the topsoil blew away, and his father or grandfather, I forget right now, had owned that property, and literally hundreds of artifacts, he said, had just been exposed, and people had come through and collected them by the wagon load. And so that was his explanation, and the tribal descendants believed that that was accurate for why there were so few artifacts still found in that location. But the dig came up with almost nothing in that precise spot. I'm not going to reveal to you the end of the book, because it's got kind of a surprise ending, but there ends up being an explanation for why all of these theories may be true, but it's a little convoluted for right now.
This is kind of a memory question. So, when you talked about the soldiers' conduct post-battle, how much of that actually makes a difference in how we remember it as a battle versus a massacre?
That's a really good question, and not as easy to answer as I thought. So I'm not going to be glib. What I'll say is that the main, or the sort of most eminent historians of the Plains Indian Wars, especially Bob Utley, now look back on Sand Creek and they say that this was a massacre because it was a surprise attack on a group of people who weren't well armed and who believed that they were at peace with the aggressing party. And so from Bob's perspective, Sand Creek was a massacre, and that doesn't seem to have anything to do with whether or not Chivington's men committed atrocities in the aftermath of the slaughter. But I think you're asking, in my view, a more complicated question because you said it's a memory question. And so in terms of the way that we remember this event, I think it's absolutely crucial that we understand Chivington's troops to have committed these horrible acts, to have mutilated the corpses of Arapaho and Cheyenne, especially women and children. And I don't want to get too. You'll note that my talk was actually quite careful to stay away from some of these descriptions, but they're extraordinarily graphic. A pregnant woman eviscerated, and so those memories, I think, play a very, very important role in how we understand this having been a massacre, because they speak to the motivations of the soldiers there, and they suggest a kind of thirst for vengeance, which might lead to a massacre.
Richard Griffin from Alexandria, Virginia. Weren't Chivington and his men present at Glorieta Pass?
Chivington was at Glorieta Pass. That's where he secured his reputation. He was promoted as a result of his very likely honorable service at Glorieta Pass. Historians now look back and wonder whether or not Chivington may have inflated his importance at Glorieta Pass. But what ended up happening is that in the wake of Glorieta Pass, he was promoted, but then his career stalled. And Chivington very, very much wanted to be a United States Senator. He wanted to get into politics. And so one of the explanations for why something like Sand Creek might have happened is that Chivington had personal reasons that he was trying to use the Civil War as an engine of career mobility. Lots of soldiers did this. And that Sand Creek was kind of a last-ditch effort on his part to recapitulate his heroics at Glorieta Pass.
My name's Lee Fisher from Oxford, Ohio. I'm an older graduate student in anthropology. This is a National Park Service application, perhaps a resources question. You mentioned the early Comanche raids through Texas, and it's well documented by many historians that those same depredations were committed by the Comanche on white people. Does the Park Service have any intent ever to document that kind of activity on the part of Native Americans and conversely turn that into the same kind of national park?
I mean, I'm sort of back to the same place that I was earlier, where I can't speak to exactly what the Park Service is going to do.
Do you ever think they'd have the political courage to do that?
What I would say is that at the Sand Creek site, there's actually a fair amount of documentation about what's known as the Hungate Massacre, or the Hungate murders. This was a family that was slaughtered on the plains east of Denver, very likely by Arapahoes, though people don't know for certain, in the summer of 1864. These were Native people who were not part of Black Kettle's bands. They were not camped at Sand Creek. But white authorities in Colorado Territory used the Hungate murders as a pretext for drumming up some of the outrage that led to Sand Creek. So, speaking to your question, the Park Service does document what happened to the Hungates. The family was butchered. And then their corpses were brought to Denver where they were displayed. As to the broader question of whether or not there's going to be a national memorial or a historic site devoted specifically to the victims of Native Americans, I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I mean, I would say, broadly speaking, again, that we have a number of monuments and memorials throughout the American West to white settlers, but not specifically to these sorts of atrocities. This is the last question.
Al Mack from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Question about how we categorize historical events. Chivington's comments, I think, can be safely called self-serving. That aside, can we really consider this to be an event of the American Civil War? It may have happened in 1864 during the years of the Civil War, but really wasn't that connected to the Civil War?
Yes. And again, as I mentioned earlier, in my view, the Civil War is both a war of empire and also becomes a war of liberation over time. That war of empire plays itself out in Colorado Territory and in the Trans-Mississippi West, with a number of different engagements, battles, massacres, other with Native American groups, because the United States is going to move into the West. That's one of the cornerstones of the Republican Party's vision for the American people, that the federal government will sponsor the move into the West. Again, with the Pacific Railroad Act, Homestead Act, the Moral Land Grant Act, and others, Department of Agriculture, you can go on and on and on. All of these are an outgrowth of the United States Civil War. All of those pieces of legislation passed, at least in significant measure, because Southerners have absented themselves from the United States Congress, And again, because the American people have voted Republicans into office, because the American people voted Republicans into office in 1860. And so is Sand Creek part of the Civil War? It's an outgrowth of the Civil War. It's an outgrowth of the same mechanisms and processes that birthed the Civil War. But also, it's an episode that features Civil War soldiers. United States volunteer soldiers on the federal payroll, soldiers who were mustered into the Union Army. And so, again, I wasn't being entirely glib when I said, yes, I think it is. Is it as central a part of the Civil War story as some of the other events that people are going to be talking about here? No, I don't think it is. I don't want to overstate my claims. That's not the kind of historian I am. But I do think that it's a very, very important story, and I think that it's worth telling. Thank you all again.